Hello, my little Lovecraftians, and welcome back to another reading of the Dunwich Horror. Last time we abruptly left off due to my own Lovecraftian horror taking place. Bad internet connection. It was swiftly thrown off as we left off on the word swiftly, so I'm going to be continuing that today. Those who knew horrors had gone as swiftly as it had come. There were even bold souls who proposed an offensive expedition down to the glen, though they did not venture to set an actual example to those still reluctant, the majority. When night came again, the barricading was repeated, though there was less huddling together of families. In the morning both the Friar and Seth Bishop's houses reported excitement amongst the dogs and vague sounds and stenches from afar, while early explorers noted with horror a fresh set of monstrous tracks in the road skirting to Sentiat Hill. As before, the sides of the road showed a bruising, indicating of the blasphemous stupendous bulk of horror, whilst the conformation of the tracks seemed to agree a passage in two directions, as if the moving mountains had come from the Cold Spring Glen and returned to it along the same path. At the base of the hill, a 30-foot swath of crushed shrubbery saplings led steeply upwards, and the seekers gasped when they saw that even the most perpendicular places did not deflect the inexorable trail. Whatever the horror was, it could scale a sheer stony cliff of almost complete verticality, and as the investigators climbed around to the hill's summit by safer routes, they saw the trail ended, or rather, reversed there. It was here that the Whatleys used to build their hellish fires and chant their hellish rituals, by the table-like stone of May Eve and Hollow Mass. Now the very stone formed the center of a vast space threshed amount by the mountain's horror, whilst upon its slightly concave surface was a thick and fetid deposit of some tarry thickness, observed on the floor of the ruined Whatley's farmhouse. When the horror escaped, men looked at one another and muttered. Then they looked down the hill. Apparently the horror had descended by a route much the same as of its ascent. To speculate what was futile. Reason, logic, and normal ideas of motivation stood confounded. Only old Zebellion, who was not with the group, could have done justice to the situation or suggested a plausible explanation. Thursday night began much like the others, but it ended less happily. The whippoorwills in the glen have screamed with such unusual persistence that many could not sleep, and about 3 a.m., the witching hour, all the party's telephones rang tremendously. Those who took down the receivers heard a mad voice shriek out, "Help! Oh my God!" And some thought a crashing sound followed the breaking off of explanation. There was nothing more. No one dared do anything, and no one knew till morning whence the call came. Then those who had heard it called everyone on the line and found that only the friars did not reply. The truth appeared an hour later, when a hastily assembled group of armed men trudged out to the friar's place at the head of the glen. It was horrible, yet hardly a surprise. There were more swaths and monstrous print, but there were no longer any house. It had caved in like an eggshell, and amongst the ruins nothing living or dead could be discovered, only a stench and a tarry stickiness. The Elmer Fries had been erased from Dunwich. In the meantime, a quieter, yet even more spiritually poignant phase of the horror had been blackly unwinded itself behind the closed doors of a shelf-light room in Arkham. The curious manuscript recorded of a diary of Wilbur Whatley, delivered to the Mastodic University for translation, has caused much worry and bafflement amongst the experts in language both ancient and modern. Its very alphabet, notwithstanding a general resemblance to the heavily shaded Arabic used in Mesopotamia, being absolutely unknown to any available authority. The final conclusion of the linguist was that the text represented an artificial alphabet, giving the effects of a cipher, though none of the unusual methods of cryptograph solution seemed to furnish any clue. Even when applied to the bases of every tongue, the writers might conceivably have used the ancient book taken from the Whatley's quarters, while absorbingly interesting, in several cases prompting to open up new and terrible lines of research among philosophers and men of science, were of no assistance whatever in this matter. One of them, a heavy tome, which its iron clasp was in another unknown alphabet. This one of a very different cast. resembling Sancroft more than anything else. The old ledger was at length given wholly into the charge of Dr. Armitage, both because of the peculiar interest in the Whatley's matter and because of his wide linguistic learnings and skills in the mystical formula of antiquity of the Middle Ages. Armitage had an idea the alphabet might be something astronomically used in certain forbidden cults, which have come down from old times, and which have inherited many forms of the tradition from the wizards of the Circanic world. That question, however, he did not deem vital, since it would be unnecessary to know the origins of the symbols, as if he suspected they were used as a cipher in the modern language. It was his belief, considering the great amount of text involved, the writer would scarcely have wished the trouble of using another speech than his own, save perhaps in certain special formulas and incantations. Accordingly, he attacked the manuscript with the primary assumption the bulk of it was in fact English. Dr. Amerton knew from the repeated failures of his colleagues that the riddle was a deep, complex one, and no simple mode of solution could merit even a trial. Although late August he formatted himself with masked lore of cryptophony, drawing upon the fullest resources of his own library, and waiting night after night amidst the arcana of tremendous Pelgalvi, Gessler porta di friantat librum notis, divertis tron di schaffens falsor, Cymers Ferask, Davian thickness, 18th century terrestrices, and such fairly modern authorities as Blair von Martin and Kulber Kalkrufus. He intersped his study of the books, which attacks of the manuscript itself, and in time became convinced that he had to deal with one of the subtlest and most intriguing of cryptograms, in which many separate lists of corresponding letters are arranged like the multiplication table, and the message built up the arbitrary key words known only to the initiated. The older authorities seemed rather more helpful than the newer ones, and Armitage concluded that the code of the manuscript was one of great antiquity, no doubt handed down through a long line of mystical experiments. Several times he seemed near daylight, only to be set back by some unforeseen obstacle. Then, as September approached, the clouds began to clear. Certain letters, as usual in certain parts of the manuscript, emerged differently and unmistakably, and it became obvious that the text was indeed English. On the evening of September 2nd, the last major barrier gave way, and Dr. Armitage read for the first time a continuous passage of Wilbur Whatley's Annals. It was in truth a diary, as all had thought, and it was couched in a style clearly showing the mixed occult erudition and general illiteracy of the strange being who wrote it. Almost the first long passage that the Armitage deciphered, an entry date, dated November 26, 1916, proved highly startling and disquieting. It was written, he remembered, by a child of 3.5, who looked like a lad of 12 or 13. Today learned the alcohol for the Sabbath, and ran, which did not like it being answered from the will and not from the air, that upstairs more ahead of me I had thought it would be, and it's not like to have much earth brain. She a lamb hutchet Coley Jack, which he went to bite me, and the lamb says he would kill me if be dast. I guess he won't. Grandfather kept me saying doleful formula last night, and I think I saw the inner city at the 2 magnetic poles. I shall go to those poles when the earth is cleared off. If I can break through with the home formula I committed. They form the air told me the Sabbath, and will be all my years before I can clear of this earth. I guess grandfather will be dead then, so I shall have to learn all the angles of the planes and all the formulas between the year and the fair before from the outside will help. But they cannot take body without human blood. That upstairs looks like it will have to be the right cast. I can see it little when I make the voyage sign or blow the powder from Epigan's gast it, and near them by the May eve of the hill. The other space were off some. I wonder bow. I shall look when the earth is cleared, and there are no earth beings on it. He that came with the occult Sabbath, I may be transfigured, there being much of outside to work on. Morning found Dr. Armitage in a cold sweat of terror, in a frenzy of wakeful concentration. He had not left the manuscript all night, but sat at the table, under the electric light, turning page after page with shaking hands as fast as he could decipher the cryptic text. He had nervously telephoned his wife he would not be home, and when she brought him a breakfast from the house, he could scarcely dispose of a mouthful. All that day he read on. Now, the halted the maddening of a repeated application of the complex key became necessary. Lunch and dinner were brought to him, but he ate only the smallest fraction of either. Towards the middle of the night he drowsed off in his chair, but soon woke out of a tangle of nightmares, almost as hideous as the truths and menaces to man's existence that he had uncovered. On the morning of September 4th, Professor Rice and Dr. Morgan insisted on seeing him for a while, and departed tremendously in ashen gray. That evening he went to bed, but slept only fitfully. Wednesday, the next day, he was back at the manuscript, and began to take copious notes, both from the current sections and from those he had already deciphered. In the small hours of the night, he slept a little in an easy chair in his office, but was at the manuscript again before dawn. Some time before noon, his physician, Dr. Hartwell, called to see him and insisted that he cease work. He refused, intimating that it was of the most vital importance for him to complete the readings of the diary, and promising an explanation in due course of time, of course. That evening, just as twilight fell, he finished his terrible pursuit and sank back to exhaustion. His wife, lovingly bringing him dinner, found him in a half-comatose state, but he was conscious enough to warn her off with a sharp cry when he saw her eyes wander towards the notes he had taken. Weakly rising, he gathered up the scribbled paper and sealed them all in a great envelope, which immediately was placed inside his coat pocket. He had sufficient strength to get home, but was so clearly in need of medical aid that Dr. Hartford was summoned at once. As the doctor put him to bed, he could only mutter over and over again, "But what? What in God's name can we do?" Dr. Armitage slept, but was partly delirious the next day. He made no explanation to Hartwell, but in calmer motion spoke of the imperative need of a long conference with Rice and Morgan. His wilder wanderings were very startled indeed, including frantic appeals that something, in a boarded-up farmhouse, be destroyed, and fantastic references to some plan for the extirpation of the entire human race, and all animals and vegetable life from this earth by some terrible elder race of beings from another dimension. He would shout that the world was in danger, since the elder things wished to strip it and drag it away from the solar system and cosmos of matter into some other plane or phase of or entirety form which it had once fallen. For relations of eons at other times he would call from the dreaded Necronomicon and Democritus of Fabricius, in which he seemed hopeful of finding some formula to check the peril he conjured up. "Stop them! Stop them!" he would shout. "Those Whatleys meant to them, in them, the worst of all is left. Tell Rice and Morgan we must do something. It's a blind business, but I know we must make the powder. It hasn't been fed since the 2nd of August, when Wilbur came here to his death, and at that rate, Dr. Armitage had a sound physique despite his 73 years, and slept off his disorder that night without developing any real fever. He woke late Friday, clear of head, thought sober, with no fever, with a gnarling fear and tremendous sense of responsibility. Saturday afternoon, he felt able to go over to his library and summon Rice and Morgan for a conference. And the rest of that day and evening, the three men tortured their brains in the wildest speculation and the most desperate debate. Strange and terrible books were drawn voluminously from the stack of shelves and from secure places of storage, and diagrams and formulas were copied with feverish haste, bewilderingly of abundance. Of skepticism there was none. All three had seen the body of Wilbur Whatley as it lay on the floor in a room of that very building, and after that, not one of them could feel even slightly inclined to treat the diary as a madman's ravings. Opinions were divided as to notify the Massachusetts State Police, where the negative finally won. There were things involved which simply could not be believed by those who had not seen. A sample, as indeed was made clear during certain subsequent investigations. Late at night, the conference disbanded without having developed a defined plan, but all day Sunday, Artermage was busy comparing formulas and mixing chemicals obtained from the college laboratory. The more he reflected on the hellish diary, the more he was inclined to doubt the efficiency of the material agent in stamping out the entity which Wilbur Whatley had left behind him, the earth-threatening entity which, unknown to him, was to burst forth in a few hours and become the memorable Dunwich Horror. Monday was a repetition of Sunday, which Dr. Aldridge, for the task in hand, required an infamy of research and experiment. Further consultations of the monstrous diary thought about various changes of plan, and he knew that even in the end, a large amount of uncertainty must remain. By Tuesday, he had a defined line of action mapped out, and believed he would try a trip to the Dunwich within a week. Then on Wednesday, the great shock came. Tucked obscurely away in a quarter of the Outcomes Advertiser was a fictitious little item from the Associated Press telling what a record-breaking monster the bootleg whiskey of the Dunwich had raised up. Artermage, half-stunned, could only telephone for Rice and Morgan. Far into the night they discussed, and the next day was a whirlwind of preparation on the part of them all. Artermage knew he would be meddling with terrible powers, yet saw there was no other way to annul the deeper and more malgin mending which others had done before him. And that concludes our reading today of The Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. I did notice that part about needing a blood sacrifice to be human, and I'm sure to all of us that Whatley isn't human. So I'm wondering if that night Whatley's mother disappeared, it was him pertaining the blood sacrifice. What do you guys think? Feel free to comment, like, and subscribe, and tell me your thoughts on the Dunwich Horror so far. As it has been summoned, as it has been pertained and acclaimed, many thoughts are going through my head on how they could get rid of such an abomination from this world. What do you think?